Welcome back, Dr. Johnson. Really glad to have you. And I understand that today we're going to talk about a couple aspects that are fairly important to gout. And one of the things that you mentioned was the need, somebody who's hyperuricemic like myself and suffered from gout may actually have a driver to eat gouty foods. So I don't know if that's a lead in, but anyway,
That's a
let's
pretty good lead in. Well, first off, Pete, it's really great to be back on your show, Dr. Pete. And it's great to be able to talk to people who actually are suffering from gout because I really want to be able to. I've been studying uric acid for many years, and it'll be kind of fun to share some of the discoveries that we've had and some of the discoveries that have been made by others so that we can really talk about this disease better and better understand it. And one of the, there's 5 tastes, right? There's sweet, there's salt, there's bitter, and there's sour. And these are the 4 main tastes that we know that our taste buds pick up. But there's a 5th taste, and it's called umami. And that taste was discovered by a Japanese scientist, maybe about 100 years ago. And so umami is a Japanese word, of course, but it really refers to a savory flavor. And we know it as having a very beautiful taste that many of us love. In fact, most people love it. So just like sweet and sour are desired, sweet and salt are desired, and sour and bitter are usually, to tell you there's a toxin. The umami is, gives us a taste where we're searching for foods that carry the umami flavor.
Yeah.
Some of the things that carry the umami flavor are Caesar salads have a lot of umami in it. Anchovies have umami. Things like blue cheese, the blue in the cheese is yeast, and that contains a fair amount of umami. And you would normally say, do I like yeast? But actually, most of us like blue cheese and gorgonzola cheese. Things like shrimp and lobsters and these rich shellfish, they contain a lot of umami, and things like gravies, and when you simmer a sauce and it gets rich and delicious, that's often very high in umami. Things like beer, and a lot of people love beer. The brewer's yeast really is filled with umami, and so there's a lot of there's a lot of foods that we love that contain this umami flavor.
And red meat?
Yeah, red meat,
Okay.
especially red meats more than white meats, and things like especially processed red meats where you kind of simmer it and stuff because it leads to some breakdown, and or when you treat it, so there's some breakdown of the meat and release of things that give the umami flavor. So these are kind of foods that we love. A lot of people view them as healthy. Yeah. And yet, what I'm going to tell you, Pete, is that these foods are attractive because they raise uric acid. And that's what I'm going to tell you today, is that there's actually a taste that we have for foods that will raise uric acid. And this sounds surprising, but it's actually why a lot of people develop gout, is because of this love of foods that we all have. And that, coupled with our genetics, really leads us to developing gout. So let's talk about this. So what exactly is the umami taste? So umami is actually a taste that's due to glutamate. And glutamate is an amino acid. It's glutamate, like a break.
Or glutamate or glutamine?
Glutamate.
Okay, got
it. And so glutamate is, it's like an amino acid. So it's in meats, of course. Meats but it doesn't really correlate with meat intake. So there's a lot of meats that may be relatively low in umami, but glutamate is an amino acid. So in general, meats tend to have some umami for sure, and the ones that are strongest are like red meats and certain fish, actually, like anchovies and mackerel. And so glutamate binds to a glutamate receptor on the taste buds, and it gives us this, pleasure response, and we like it. Now, the other umami stimulant. Well, let me tell you a little bit more about glutamate first off. So glutamate, when they discovered it, they said, hey, we can add glutamate to foods to try to make, since it's liked so much. And so they made this thing called MSG.
Right.
Or monosodium glutamate. And it's this additive that's like added to, Doritos and different things and it makes the chips tend to taste better.
Wow.
It's very common added to Chinese foods and Chinese restaurants. And so if you have a little too much glutamate, there's even this thing called Chinese restaurant syndrome, where if you eat too much glutamate, you may get like a headache or, that kind of thing. But generally speaking, glutamate is, present in specific foods in high amounts. And some of the big ones, we just talked about. Another one that we haven't talked about is tomatoes, and especially like cooked tomatoes, dried tomatoes. Those kinds of tomatoes can contain a fair amount of glutamate. Now, interestingly, when you eat glutamate, it can be metabolized a variety of ways, but one very interesting pathway is that it can end up being used to generate uric acid, and there's actually papers that show that if you inject glutamate into animals, that they increase their uric acid production. And it's even more so than if you inject glutamine or other amino acids. Glutamate seems to be very special. And it was noted many, many years ago, it's kind of an interesting finding, that people with gout have high glutamate levels in their blood. This was noted in the 1960s. No one totally understands why, but glutamate is special to, especially associated with the disease gout. Now, glutamate it works on the taste receptor, but there's another substance, or actually a few substances, that interact with glutamate, and when they're both present, they stimulate the taste by tenfold more, 5 to 10-fold more. I mean, it's really a major amplifier. And the substances that do that are breakdown products of nucleic acids, or, like DNA, RNA. And when they break down, some of the substance, there's two substances in particular. One's called AMP, or adenosine monophosphate, and the other one's called IMP,
right,
inosine monophosphate. And these substances get broken down to uric acid when you metabolize them. They're actually precursors of uric acid, and they actually stimulate the umami taste as well. And so,
level of the taste bud,
at the level of the taste bud,
at the level
of the taste bud. And so, you probably have heard, so AMP and IMP, they break down into purines, and sometimes people with gout are told to be on a low purine diet, which is basically a reduction of these kinds of substances.
Right.
To pick foods that are low in these substances. So a low purine diet is often recommended to people with gout. They're given these tables, and those tables, if you look at the purine foods, they're all umami foods. They're overlap perfectly. And so it turns out that, red meats have glutamate, and they're rich in the IMP and AMP. And AMP and IMP really are, anytime you eat anything that's got a lot of that's very cellular. It has a lot of nuclei, like yeast, like caviar, like anchovies have like small cells that have a lot of nuclei. These things break. Liver is a good one. If you eat like liver and onions, liver has a lot of this AMP and IMP. And so you can get a very high load of AMP and IMP. And if you feed a person AMP or IMP, their uric acid shoots up within a couple hours. And if you, so it turns out that glutamate and AMP and IMP give you this umami taste. And foods that have both really are a great way to are very tasty. So beer contains both a lot of glutamate and a lot of AMP and IMP. And it's probably the richest source of umami. And so when you eat these foods, they actually generate uric acid, and you can measure the uric acid in the blood, and it goes up, typically within 2 to 3 hours. You can also make uric acid from sugar. And so when you eat sugar, but the uric acid goes up faster, it goes up like at 15 minutes. And if you drink alcohol, that also produces uric acid.
Very fast.
Very fast, 15, 30 minutes. Exactly. So now we have these 3 categories of food. We have sugar, we have alcohol, and we have umami foods. Now, interestingly, when you do questionnaires of large populations of people with gout, and you ask them what triggers their gout, very high on the list turns out to be alcohol. That's a very common one. Soft drinks are very high. They're always in the top 5. But there's interesting, a lot of them turn out, to be purine-rich foods or umami-rich foods. So, beer is particularly bad, of course, but things like tomatoes were reported to be able to precipitate gout in the Maori population in a big study that was done there. It was like, in their top 10 foods that can trigger gout. And so things like, like some people, like the Bloody Mary is a mixture of alcohol with tomato juice, and that tomato juice is very rich in glutamate. It's one reason it tastes so good. And there's some places in the country, and in Australia and in Canada in particular, where you can get what's called a red beer, where they add like tomato juice to a beer. And I would never think that would taste good, but actually it's a mixture of umami. And there used to be this juice called clamato juice. I don't know if it's still around.
I'm familiar with that.
But clamato juice is basically the shellfish that is very high in the AMP and IMP. And it turns out that clamato with the tomato and all that turns out to be a super rich source of umami, and it can trigger gout. So there's a couple big things there. And, the first thing is that for anyone who has gout, to be aware that you have a taste, that we all have a taste to seek foods that can raise uric acid. I think that's an important thing to know. And I think it's also important to recognize that foods that, what are the umami foods, so that you can be careful about not eating too much of them at any one time. And so, go ahead.
I was going to ask you because one of the areas that I've really dug into now is is sugar addiction. Yeah. And you guys produced that one paper where you had the taste blind mice.
Yes.
And there were 2 relatively small paragraphs in that paper of results where, there was quite a lot actually. It talked about the connection between the sweet taste and the signaling with the brain, and also the gut-brain axis. And then there was actually a note about fructose activating delta phosphate.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. We can talk about that, and we'll bring the umami in there too.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so you've got these 3 tastes that we all love. Sweet, salt, and umami are the 3 ones that we really love. Those tastes probably evolved
Yeah.
to have us pick those kinds of foods. Whereas sour and bitter were the tastes that kind of tried to teach us to not eat those foods because they might contain toxins and so forth.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it turns out that all three of these foods activate this survival switch that I write about. And so there was a switch. For those who may not have heard me, I have a book called Nature Wants Us to Be Fat, where I talk about our research that discovered that there is a biological switch that triggers the development of obesity. And this switch is turned on particularly by sugar and specifically by fructose. And that when you eat sugar, which contains fructose, and so things like table sugar, high fructose corn syrup, these guys are rich, really rich in fructose. Fruit juices too, unfortunately, apple juice. Not so much natural fruits. They contain fructose, but much smaller amounts. And they have a lot of good things. But they can trigger gout, by the way. So anything with fructose can trigger gout. But they also trigger the biologic switch that animals use to help them survive by helping, during times when there's famine or no food around. And when these animals eat fructose, it triggers a process to accumulate fat, to become diabetic, pre-diabetic, actually, to raise your blood pressure and to do all these things. It's actually a survival response. Animals want that because when you're living out in nature, it's live or die.
Yeah.
It's and there's lots of times when there's no food and a big, drought comes in or some kind of change in weather or a change in some kind of change that suddenly there's just not much food around. So you have to be able to store fat for those days when you need it. And animals will eat fructose primarily like in berries and honey, but they'll eat huge amounts of it to trigger this switch to make them fat. Now, when they trigger that switch, they actually generate uric acid. And although umami specifically makes uric acid, when you eat sugar, the fructose, when it's metabolized, produces uric acid as well. So when you eat sugar, uric acid goes up in the blood, and that's why sugar can trigger a gout attack, and fruit juice can trigger a gout attack. And even really sweet fruits like pineapple and watermelon and apples and pears can trigger gout attacks. Some fruits don't as much, and vitamin C actually sort of counters it. But you can definitely get a gout attack from sugar. And it's because it generates the fructose generates uric acid, and the uric acid goes up in the cell, and inside the cell, it actually triggers the biologic pathways to try to gain fat. But when the uric acid also is produced, it gets out into the circulation. And if it gets too, then it can contribute to the uric acid in your blood, and it can raise the uric acid.
Right.
So we were interested in sugar addiction and its relationship to this switch. Is the switch driven by the taste? In other words, are we getting fat because sugar tastes so good that we keep eating it?
Right.
And it's a kind of an attractive idea because I don't know about you, but before I knew sugar was bad, I would love a milkshake and a chocolate cake, and before I realized that it was making me very fat. There was a period of my life where I loved that stuff. I still love it, but I'm more careful. Anyway, so what we did is we took mice. Well, first, another group took mice that could not taste sweet. They'd been manipulated so they had no sweet taste, but they still craved sugar. They still loved sugar, even though they couldn't taste it. If you gave them an artificial sugar, they didn't like it. The taste bud was driving the artificial sugar response, and it was stimulating dopamine in the brain in the normal animal. But if you get rid of the sweet taste, artificial sugars do nothing. but regular sugar is still addictive, and you still get fat from it. And we did the same study using mice that can't taste at all. These poor guys, they have no taste, but they were very sensitive. They still liked sugar. They
Right.
still liked fructose, and they still got fat. Now, there was one big effect of taste, and it did affect how much sugar you ate.
Right.
So if the taste clearly encourages you to eat more. So even though if you don't like sugar, if you can't taste sugar, you're still going to eat it. You're still going to seek it out. If there's a bottle of water and a bottle of sugar water, you're going to somehow sense that sugar water makes you feel better. And you're going to drink that even though you can't taste it. So sugar drives craving independently of its taste, but the taste makes you drink more.
Right.
So that's how it works. So then we say, well, okay, well, what's driving the craving if it's not taste? And when we blocked the fructose from being metabolized, so the fructose couldn't be broken down.
Yeah.
So it couldn't generate uric acid, for example. When we did that, we completely blocked the craving of fructose. So the craving of fructose is driven by the metabolism, not by the taste. And then we did a further study, which was really cool. We knocked out the metabolism of fructose in different parts of the body. These are in laboratory mice. We didn't do it in people. So, but when you do it to laboratory mice, it turns out that the craving for sugar is driven really by the intestine and we think the brain, that kind of an intestine-brain connection. Whereas the obesity from fructose is driven more by the liver-brain connection. And so there's the liver and the intestine actually can be separated in terms of their effects. So it turns out that craving, you can crave sugar, but if you block metabolism of sugar in the liver, you can eat all the sugar you want, you're not going to get fat. So, and you'll love the sugar. And we've now been able to do that other ways. There are ways in laboratory animals where you can manipulate things so that they still love and eat lots of sugar, but they're completely protected from gout and obesity. So maybe one day we'll be able to do, have that for people, but right now it's kind of tough love because if you eat sugar, you're going to raise your uric acid, you're going to trigger gout, and it's going to be painful for those of us who suffer from gout. So it turns out that salt also activates the switch. And when we measure uric acid, it goes up inside the cell, but not outside. So it's not enough to actually go up in the blood. But salt actually raises uric acid in the liver. It's sort of interesting.
How does it do that? I was going to ask, that was one of my questions actually, because aldose reductase seems to be activated by it, which is the polyol pathway. And I guess what I'm curious is how that enzyme is actually getting activated.
Yeah, so let's talk about that for a second. So as I mentioned, fructose triggers the switch. So most of the way we get fructose is we get fructose from sugar, from the sugar we eat, from the high fructose corn syrup that's added to our foods, and from fruit juice. So, originally I was thinking that's the primary way that we get fructose, but actually our bodies can make fructose. And one of the ways it does it is it makes it, actually the only way it does it is it makes it from glucose. So glucose can be converted to fructose. And interestingly, fructose can be converted to glucose. So even though these two sugars act sort of differently, fructose is there to store fat and glucose is there to burn energy, they can interplay and switch. But that switch from glucose to fructose requires an enzyme. And that enzyme, as you mentioned, is aldose reductase. And that enzyme is normally not active. Normally, it's present in only certain parts of the body, like in the inner part of the kidney, and it really isn't very active, but it can be turned on by a number of things. So if one thing is if you eat sugar, that actually stimulates in a kind of a positive way for this, this enzyme goes up to make sugar as well. So when you're eating a lot of sugar, your body starts making it, or eating a lot of sugar, high fructose corn syrup, your body will also start making fructose, and it has to make it from carbs. So if you're not on carbs, that pathway doesn't work very well. So that's why a low carb diet, protects you not only from the fructose you eat, but from the fructose you make, because if there's not a lot of glucose around,
Right.
then you can't convert it so easily you can't make too much fructose if there's not enough glucose around. So high salt diet, the way it works is it raises the salt concentration in the blood. And so if you eat a lot of salt, you'll notice that you get thirsty, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So when you get thirsty, that's because the brain senses that the salt concentration in the blood is high. And so it triggers thirst, so you drink water to correct it, because if you got high salt concentrations in the blood, the blood doesn't like that. So you can neutralize it by either getting rid of the salt or by drinking water. It takes a while to get rid of the salt. So you become thirsty and you drink water and you correct it. But when the serum sodium goes, or the serum salts or sodium go up in your blood, that also triggers this enzyme that makes fructose. And it's sort of interesting, fructose is helping to drive fat production, and fat becomes actually another source of water for the animal, because when you burn fat, you produce water. So it turns out that when you get dehydrated, mildly dehydrated, that's a good enough of a trigger to start making fructose in your body to help you reduce fat, which actually helps provide water to make up for the dehydration as well. So my collaborator, Gaby Sanchez Lozada, who's a scientist in Mexico, she's been interested in climate change and its effects on obesity. And she said, well, maybe, if you're severely dehydrated, you're not eating anything, you're not going to have a lot of carbs on board, right? So when you're severely dehydrated, you just need to drink water. You're not going to try to store fat. But if you're not severely dehydrated and you've got a lot of carbs and you're well fed, but you eat salt, then you have the carbs in your body to convert to fructose. Plus, you're not so severely dehydrated that your appetite's knocked out. So when you get a little bit, that salt actually stimulates food intake as well as water intake. And so what happens is what she did was she took animals and just exposed them to heat several hours a day, and just reduce how much water they got just for a few hours a day. And this kind of created the setting of going outside in that hot 99-degree sun in the heat of Denver, for example, where, after 2 or 3 hours, you're ready to be back inside. And that, it turns out that just that short of an exposure is enough to activate this enzyme and help convert carbs you're eating into fructose. So you don't have, it's true if you eat high glycemic carbs like rice and potatoes, they produce a lot of glucose. So they're kind of like the easiest way to make fructose is to eat these things. But if you get a little dehydrated, plus eat those carbs, whoa, you can you develop fatty liver and insulin resistance very rapidly. So it turns out that of these, going back, sugar can activate this switch to become fat, salt can, and even heat stress and mild dehydration, what's happening in the world with the warming of the climate. And so, we're concerned that climate change may have effects to increase the risk for obesity and fatty liver and things like that as well. And then going back to the umami, so the umami is another direct way of raising uric acid and inside the cell, and it can activate the switch as well. And in fact, it activates that enzyme to make fructose as well. So it acts as an amplifier. So the whole, so it turns out that these three tastes that we developed over millions of years were there to help us pick foods to help us identify ways where we could help store fat for the dangerous times in our lives when there's not much food around. So it was all meant to help us. And the problem is that now in today's society, we have a lot of sugar and fructose in the food. We have a lot of umami. We have a lot of salt. You can go to the grocery store. Someone told me there's like 20,000. The average grocery store has like 20,000 different items. I don't know if that's accurate. Seems like it's very high a number, but that's what I was told. But for sure, when you think about all the food availability that many of us have, you can imagine that we can pick those foods that our tastes like, and we can rapidly be activating this switch.
The chronic activation.
Right.
Because people are eating that way all day long, more or less. Many.
Yes.
People. So what was the second thing you were going to talk to me about in terms of the gout?
Yeah, so I do want to tell this story is really important. And this one is, it's a little scary, but I think people with gout need to know about this.
Oh, yes.
This is very important, okay? So for years and years, physicians viewed gout as strictly, a type of arthritis that, you get an attack of gout in your hip or usually it's in your big toe or your ankle or your wrist but it was viewed as, a terrible pain when you had it, but you could then take pain medicines, it goes away, and, it may not come back for a while. And it's not really, other than the arthritis, which can be severe, we haven't thought of it as having many other major problems. Yes, it's associated with kidney stones for sure. And yes, there's a very strong relationship with chronic kidney disease, but most physicians have viewed gout as being really an arthritis.
Yeah.
Our work has suggested that uric acid may have other roles, including helping trigger this switch. And so that it may be driving some biology like obesity and hypertension. And we've been publishing on that, and it's not 100% accepted by everybody, but the data is pretty strong. But one thing that has just been discovered in the last 5 years is the scary part, that the crystals that go in the joints and on the skin, where you get this thing called tophi.
Right.
The crystals can also go to the blood vessels. And, there have been isolated reports of, some uric acid crystals in patients with long-standing gout, being present in their aorta, or in their heart valves or in their coronaries. There have been isolated reports, but no one has really studied it very significantly. And a few years ago, there was the development of a new type of X-ray called the dual energy CT scan or DECT scan, DECT. And that DECT scan can be modified so that it can see uric acid crystals.
Oh, wow.
And so you can do an X-ray and actually see the uric acid crystals, like in the hand, like in the wrist, like in the big toe. And so when they first did this, they go, oh my gosh, this is incredible. I can see all these crystals. And when I treat gout, the crystals don't really go away. They're still there. It's just the inflammation goes away. So that was the first thing, was the realization that you have to be on long-standing uric acid lowering therapy. You have to be on it for a long time before the uric acid, these crystals dissolve. There are treatments like this drug called pegloticase that can dissolve the crystals. And so if you have really bad gout, you might want to talk to your physicians about whether or not you might qualify to get this drug that can dissolve the crystals. But in the very beginning, when they got this DEX scan, all the focus was on the joints because that's where we thought the crystals were, right? And then they started finding them in other sites, and they go, oh my gosh, there's actually a lot in the back. And a lot of people with gout who have back pain, it's because you got crystals in the back. You know, do the DEX scan, they find that these crystals are actually in the spine. Another thing is that you can have crystals in other places. Like, I mean, you can even get them in the eye, for example. I mean, there's all these things that people have never really thought of that they're beginning to realize. But the DEX scan, the main power of the DEX scan was when they started seeing that there were crystals in the blood vessels. And there was a scary paper published by a German group that was published in the JAMA, which is a famous medical journal, in which they took people with gout and they found, now sit down when before you hear this, 85% of people with long-standing gout have crystals in their blood vessels. 85%, about 30% have them in their coronaries. And the crystals tend to go right where the plaque is. So let's say if you have a cholesterol plaque, you know, the thing that can cause heart attacks and aneurysms, you know, everybody has small amounts of them. I mean, there's some people who don't have any, but as we get older, it's very common to get a little bit of an atherosclerotic plaque, like in the carotid or in the coronaries. And if they build up, they're filled with cholesterol and inflammatory cells. And then they get big, they can encroach, they can kind of block the blood flow like in a coronary and cause a heart attack. It's the #1 cause of death. Or they can rupture, you know, and embolize and cause strokes. And, you know, so they're really terrible. And what they're finding is that those plaques have cholesterol, and not only do they have cholesterol in them, but many of them have uric acid crystals in them. And the crystals, you know how inflammatory they are in your joints? Well, if they're in their blood vessel, it isn't good. And they can activate these things called inflammasomes and bring in white cells. And we think they may be contributing to the inflammation that's associated with atherosclerosis and to these lesions. They've done studies where they've actually removed the atherosclerotic plaque, and they can find cholesterol crystals in there. And they've done studies with DEX scans where they identify what they say is uric acid. And then they've done it also in autopsies where they find the crystals, and then they're able to actually go in there and show that the crystals are there. So they can do a dual energy CT and then confirm it histologically. So we now know that this is like real. And the scary part is that it's much more common than we thought. And
what
so
about in people, do they find uric acid crystals like you're describing in people that don't have gout?
Yes, about 10%.
Okay.
Yes, about 10%. And many of them have hyperuricemia, 10 to 15%. So if you have a high uric acid but no gout, you can still have some crystals. Okay? And you can also have crystals in your joint and never have had a gout attack. That's been reported now too.
Right.
So the crystals, you know, if there, you know, there's something that really triggers it, that triggers the attack. That's the attack requires something a little bit more than just the presence of the crystals. There must be something else. I know your hypothesis is, you know, about fructose might be possibly driving it. I think that's a very good hypothesis. But anyway, but whatever the mechanism, urate crystals are common in people with gout, not just in their joints. And so if you do have gout, I would strongly recommend that you try to keep your serum uric acid under 6. You know, that's the minimal goal. You don't want to be getting more crystals in your blood vessels. You know, and there's a lot of benefits from being on a urate lowering drug, because there's epidemiologic studies that suggest that this may be good for the kidney disease, it may be good for high blood pressure. There's even studies out there that say that it can help reduce the risk for dementia. And so if you have gout, there's a medical recommendation to lower that uric acid to less than 6. And I strongly recommend it. Now, you could do diet first. You can try diet first. I have no problem with that. Some people will have success with their diets where they really will not lower their uric acid significantly. I've seen it. It's often difficult, though, because now we know that many of these foods, there are many foods that raise uric acid. So it's really hard to be careful, but if you are a big beer drinker, drink soft drinks, if you eat a lot of, shellfish and, like organ meats like liver, if you can reduce those things, you will have an impact on your uric acid. And if you get your uric acid under 6, that's the first step. Now, could it be that it would be better if the uric acid were 5 or 4? I think so, but that's my work. My work shows that there is a relationship with high blood pressure and obesity and diabetes that's linear, all the way down to like 4. So, if you could, to me, it would be ideal to have a uric acid of 4. That would be like perfect. But what the current recommendations by physicians and, by the medical societies is to get the uric acid at least under 6. So at least under 6, and anything more is a benefit as far as I'm concerned. Now, if you don't have gout, but you have a very high uric acid, it's time to talk to your doctor.
Right.
Because I personally, as a physician who studies uric acid and has, been doing this for a long time, I am scared when your uric acid is over 8. If it's 9 or 10, not only are you at high risk for gout and kidney stones, but you're at high risk for kidney disease, diabetes, and all these things. And my work suggests that lowering uric acid really should provide some benefit. But not all the studies show that. And so there's a controversy, and it's not FDA approved to lower uric acid in the absence of gout or kidney stones. It's not been approved. So if you do want to do that, you have to discuss it with your physician and go over the pros and cons of taking a medication or not. But anyway, if you have gout, definitely take care of yourself.
Well, I hear you, and I'm not a medical doctor, but I advocate on my channel that exactly what you just said to me, and I monitor my uric acid every day by finger sticking it. I do it before and after meals. It's taken a few years, but I've learned like what things I can eat and what things I should stay away from and so on with it. I think it's really good advice. And I'll tell you the thing that really scared the heck out of me really with it. Because about a year ago, I wasn't on allopurinol yet. And my uric acid was averaging 8 every single day. And then there were times when it was higher than that, right? And I'm going on and on. I really pushed the diet, and I knew I was where I could get to. But you're out there in this sea of arguments. You've got one side telling you, oh, it's an antioxidant. No one really knows what it's doing. But then, and so you really shouldn't lower it. And I get this argument too by people that are making comments on my videos. But then, because I dwell in the literature all the time, I saw the results about how uric acid can move into a cellular environment and then elicit these same changes. And that was when I said, all right, enough is enough. It's time to get the uric acid down. If I have to take allopurinol, I'm going to do it. And my average right now is 5.5, but quite often
Perfect.
I'm around 4.5.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
So what foods trigger gout in you or make your uric acid go up? What are the big bad foods for you?
The alcohol effect. I used to be
Yeah.
a beer drinker, and I'll just be candid with you. I still like to have an occasional beer, but now I'm really careful about it. I have, Michelob Ultras is the only thing that I'll touch. But still, when I finger stick, you can see an immediate elevation in uric acid. You have to be super careful with this. And I tell the people on my channel, look, if you're going to drink alcohol, finger stick, because you're going to see what I'm talking about, because early in this game, 3 years ago, I would have like a gin and club soda because I was only thinking about the carbs, and I would see my uric acid go up as much as 4 units. And I'm like, dude, you can't drink this.
Yeah.
You
There you
cannot
are.
have that.
You just did it, man. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Well, the story about the oxidants and antioxidants is an area I've studied a lot. And I can tell you that there are very good studies that suggest that in the test tube, uric acid is an antioxidant, okay? And it particularly knocks out an oxidant called peroxynitrites. And this is actually generated in the body. And we can, and when the uric acid reacts with peroxynitrite, it knocks out the peroxynitrite and it forms a substance called triurate. And I can measure triurate. And I found that it does go up in diseases like preeclampsia and stuff like that, suggesting that the uric acid is acting to some extent as an antioxidant in some of these diseases. But if you take the uric acid as a whole, it is definitely much more of a pro-oxidant than an antioxidant. So when uric acid reacts with an oxidant, it can actually generate radicals on its own. And that's been shown, and I've shown it actually. But it's been shown multiple times in multiple settings. And if you let uric acid get in a cytocell, it actually activates a big oxidative stress system. It stimulates oxidative stress. It actually, inside the cell, it actually causes oxidative stress. And it turns out that even in studies that have been done in people, if you lower uric acid, for example, with uricase, and you lower uric acid, oxidative stress doesn't go up. It does not go up. The lowering of uric acid does not cause oxidative stress. There was a long time ago. Well, there's this study where people have very low uric acids. The uric acids are like 1. These are people mainly living in Japan, and they have a genetic mutation where they can't reabsorb their uric acid very well from their urine. And so they pee it out. And so they end up with a very low uric acid. And the uric acid in the urine is actually pretty low because when the serum uric acid gets down, there's not much to filter. But every day, whatever they eat, just the uric acid they make just goes out the urine. And so, but they've been reported to develop acute kidney failure when they exercise. And so some of these people will go into kidney failure when they exercise. And the classic teaching was that they have oxidative stress because of the low uric acid, and that's causing damage to the muscles in the kidney when they're exercising too hard. And so I always thought that wasn't true. I thought it was because when you're exercising and you increase the blood flow to the kidney, you're going to be washing more uric acid through. And when you exercise, you generate uric acid from heat and muscle work. And so there would be more of a flux of uric acid through the urine and into the urine. And I was thinking that might lead to small crystals that could cause kidney damage. So the ultimate proof came from a patient who had this disease at Johns and was being seen by doctors at Johns Hopkins. And they said, we think it's this heat stress, too much uric acid in the urine that's causing it. So they put the patient on allopurinol, even though the serum uric acid started off at 1. Okay. And when they did that, the acute kidney injury disappeared. The guy never had it again. But that was just a single case. So recently, a group made a mouse with that mutation and developed a model where the animal develops kidney failure when it exercises. And again, they proved that it was not from from oxidative stress. It was from the uric acid spilling into the urine. And so, you can have a uric acid of 2 and, you're fine. You're fine. And the studies that say you don't were based on these patients who are developing kidney damage, from the low uric acid because they were spilling the uric acid in the urine, but it wasn't from the oxidative stress. So, at this point, I'm feeling pretty good. And as you probably know, all the studies, and with one exception, there's some studies that say that uric acid is an antioxidant in the brain and diseases like Parkinson's, and that it might be good on those conditions. But all the trials were failed,
Right.
where they tried to raise uric acid. What they got was kidney stones, but they didn't improve the Parkinson's.
So because we don't have much time, and I wanted to something that was on my mind today about all this, going back to the gout and my feeling that we have a chondrocyte that's there in relationship to the resident immune cells. And then we have the uric acid component. And I don't know, you might know this, but I've been trying to find a KSP, a solubility product constant for uric acid, because I was trying to think about, all right, if you've got a crystal in a joint and you have a cell that's actively potentially producing it under hypoglycemic and hypoxic conditions like you have with the chondrocyte, and some of that uric acid is coming out into the fluid around the cell, right? It's going to be there in relationship to a crystal that may already be there. And I'm like, so what's the solubility product constant? The only number I've been able to find is like 2 × 10⁻⁵. And they were saying in this paper, they were acting like that's a kind of a small constant. But you have to forgive me for being a chemist. I'm sitting here going, no, there's solubility constants that are like 10⁻33rd. That's a small constant. 10⁻⁵ is not that small. So that's crystal's going to be really responsive to the presence of any soluble uric acid. And now today, this issue that you brought up about uric acid in the blood vessels and whatnot, I'm really curious about the relationship.
So let's talk about that to kind of wrap up what I know. And first off, I think you probably know more about this than I do. But I will tell you, so the typical argument has been that a high uric acid is anytime it's over 6.8 milligrams per deciliter. And the reason is because at 6.8 milligrams per deciliter, uric acid tends to crystallize in water.
Right.
But the truth is that uric acid is in the blood, and that's not water.
Yeah.
And serum, if you add albumin or protein, uric acid becomes much more soluble. So it becomes soluble with heat, becomes soluble with protein in there. If you look at the urine, there are things in the urine that kind of block crystallization. They're kind of anti-crystalline factors. And you can have a uric acid concentration in the urine of 40 milligrams per deciliter, 80 milligrams per deciliter. But it's particularly like 40 without too many crystals. So maybe you have some though. So anyway, so what we, it all is based upon the environment that it's in. But not only is it contingent on the environment, but for example, a lot of times uric acid will crystallize on a roughened edge of something.
Right.
If there's something rough, that we call it a nidus, and it allows the crystals to start precipitating and crystallizing. If there's, like, for example, if you add some sand or something, it can act as a nidus to suddenly initiate crystal formation. And what we think is that in the plaques are forming with the cholesterol. They're causing a ruffling of the inner blood vessels. A lot of times they occur at bifurcations where there's a lot of turbulence, and because of that, it can initiate the plaque. But the crystals may similarly want to deposit at sites like that. Right. So the bottom line is it's very complicated.
Yes.
And it isn't just solubility.
Yeah.
There's other factors that, you know, and of course, solubility is affected by so many things.
Yes.
So you figure it out. Please figure it out, and you can help me more. Well, it's been fun to be on your show, Pete.
Yes. Thank you so much. And I got to let you go because, man, you got another one here very shortly. I think that our viewers are going to love this show.
Yeah.
There's so much that we talked about. Uh, and there's always more questions. Like, I'm really curious about the connection between the umami taste buds in the brain and delta phosphate, but we have to leave that for another day.
Yeah, I think so. But thank you. Thank you so much.
All right. Have a really good day, and I'll hit you with email.
Yeah, thanks, Pete.
All right. Bye.
Okay, bye.